So, discipline and behaviour. It's a tale that's as old as time, with every generation of teachers likely to say that behaviour in schools at that particular point in time is now the worst it's ever been. But what's clear is that the rise in challenging behaviour in schools now, in 2024, has reached something of a crisis point. We've heard today about the recruitment and retention crisis in the teaching profession, and we know that pupil behaviour is a key driver behind teachers deciding to leave the profession. Now, following the disruption to school caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, research has shown that teachers have noticed a marked increase in challenging behaviours in the classroom. And recent publications have also highlighted that school exclusions have risen during this same time period. And these are continuing to rise, with many of our most vulnerable children being disproportionately affected by this. So thank you very much for inviting me here to speak to you today. As introduced, my name is Laura Oxley. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of York, with my research interests being in behaviour management and wellbeing in schools. Now, prior to embarking on my PhD, I worked for a number of years in schools and with local authority teams, specifically working with children and young people who were either at risk of being excluded from their schools or had already been excluded from their mainstream school placements. Now, as well as working with the students themselves, I also worked with their families, with the other professionals involved with them, and of course with the staff at their schools. And one of the situations that I saw playing out again and again was that of the student behaving in a way that was not acceptable to the school, and the school responding by imposing a sanction. And then the very next day, or sometimes even the very next lesson, the student would go back into the classroom and they would repeat that exact same type of challenging behaviour. And the school would respond by, well, you guessed it, by imposing the exact same sanction. Except that then gradually these sanctions would start to escalate over time as the student became caught on this pathway towards being excluded from school. But actually, both the students and the school were caught in this entrenched cycle of repetitive challenging behaviour, followed by sanctions, followed by more challenging behaviour, followed by more sanctions, and so it continued and so forth. So for my PhD, I focused on exploring the views of senior leaders in schools on different approaches to behaviour management, approaches that were specifically more collaborative and compassionate than the default system of using rewards and sanctions to manage behaviour. Examples include restorative approaches and also collaborative and proactive solutions. But actually, it could be any approach that's based on the principles of building and maintaining positive relationships between students and staff, and on the principle of working with the students rather than imposing sanctions on them. And one of the key findings from my study was that school leaders were continuing to use this dominant approach of rewards and sanctions, not because they necessarily thought that it was the best approach or the most effective approach to managing behaviour, but because they were lacking access to sufficient funds and resources that would enable them to implement any alternative approaches in any sort of meaningful way. Another barrier that was highlighted was that school leaders were concerned about what others would think if they did try something different. They were worried about what parents would think, what their staff would think, what other school leaders would think. They didn't want their schools to be seen as a soft touch, as a school that didn't value discipline and want to enforce positive behaviour. When actually all of the school leaders that were involved in that study, they wanted to be able to support both their staff and their students in managing behaviour effectively and compassionately. But many felt that there were these barriers there that in the current system that were preventing them from being able to do so. Now, one of these barriers is something that can be worked on. We can raise awareness about the principles of these different approaches among the school community, and talk to parents and staff and school leaders about how these approaches can be more effective and compassionate, and move away from this idea that we need to have a punitive approach in response to challenging behaviour. The other barrier, the access to resources and funding, requires systemic change. It's not something that one school can do alone. Having said that, there are some schools who are trying to use alternative approaches that are trying to prioritise this more compassionate approach to persistently challenging behaviour. And we can learn from and build on their good practice, but this increased access to appropriate funding and resources for behaviour management is needed for all schools. So just to wrap up, there's a saying that goes that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And this is something that's currently happening in our schools in regard to behaviour, and this needs to change. We need to break this cycle. While school leaders might have the will and the motivation to make changes, they need the support and the access to sufficient resources and funding to be able to make that change a reality and to begin to move towards a more compassionate and humane way of managing the most challenging and vulnerable students in our education system. Thank you very much for listening.